but all the managing of it was done by the team Who to Choose. And Edward, thank you especially for making sure each week that we had the numbers to organize and to communicate with them, and it's really appreciated. And tonight we're going to end off with our home team, with David Stone and Lord Robert Winston, both of whom are well known to all of us, and both accomplished medical professionals. And the subject tonight is what's good about COVID. And I have to admit that I was thinking about what they're going to talk about over Shabbat. And I don't know if you know, but I'll recommend it, even though it's 10 years later, Robert Winston's book, Bad Ideas, which made me think about that. Robert's often very contraire, as you know. And this book was about great idea society that also had a bad element to them. And I suspect tonight we're going to hear about something that was terrible that was good. But I couldn't resist looking up what Robert wrote about viruses 10 years ago. And it said he was talking actually about the flu, the bird flu virus. But he does say, I quote, page 88, "The truth is that nobody knows how serious such a pandemic might be in Britain." And then he says, yes, it would likely cause massive disruption to industry, education, and social and medical services across the country, which we now know is just the small end of something which is huge. So just made me think about that idea in that book, which, by the way, is still worth reading as a great history of the world. But over to David and to Robert for what's good about COVID. Over to you.
Okay. We all here? Can you hear me, Robert? And shall I start?
I can hear you very well, David. Thank you.
Okay, well, I'm very impressed that Rafi had read page 88 of your book.
Yes, so am I.
Not only was he able to hold it up, but he was able to quote the page. So, I mean, taking the title to start with, what's good about COVID? You know, I couldn't help thinking through the pandemic, it's topical this week to start, as it's Havdalah, the exodus from Egypt, where they said, Ein bayet she'ein sham meit, she'ein sham meit. There's no house in which there isn't a dead person. It seems a bit perverse almost to choose as a title, what's good about COVID. But there's no doubt, I think, that we've been hearing so much bad news over recent months, it's perhaps time to actually concentrate on the positive side of it. So I guess my first question of you, and we can discuss it, is what do you think is good about COVID? Why have you picked this title and what aspects? I presume we'll start with the science, but there's plenty else we can go to.
Well, I think the first thing to say really is that it's a kind of special thanks to Rafi and to Edward, because, as they mentioned, this is the last of these series, but actually the very fact that things like this are happening is quite relevant to what is good about COVID. I mean, what we've done, I think, as a community, and what people have done generally, has actually recognized that we have to collaborate, we have to work together. And I think that's a really important message, which has, of course, come out repeatedly. People have said this already, Motzei Shabbat at different times. So I don't want to go over that ground. But there is no question that there is a possibility that we can improve human behavior. And I think that is something we could do and are doing already. Certainly, I think we're going to change our educational system, possibly as a result. I'm not even sure that the conventional syllabus is any longer appropriate. And my view would be to consider something much wider, which actually looks at issues rather than facts. And that would mean something like a baccalaureate, really. And there are a whole range of issues like that, which I think, I don't particularly want to dwell on those, because I hope we could be far-ranging. But I do think, you know, it is an extraordinary opportunity. And you know, at the other end, I just remember, seeing as, you know, we remember Rabbi Sachs, I remember that certainly on one occasion when discussing Auschwitz, and you remember there was a trial of God in Auschwitz, which is a very well-known trial, which has been depicted on television. We all saw it. But the cry went out, where is God? And of course, what Rabbi Sachs pointed out was, where is man? And I think that is a very relevant question to us now. So I think that is probably more important than the science, potentially. But the science, of course, is extraordinary. As you know, David, we've absolutely progressed extraordinarily, you know, to have actually arrived at so many different vaccines with different mechanisms so quickly, when normally we would take 15 years. And it's interesting, you look at the history of vaccines, starting back with Jenner, in the 1700s, and Tyler and Pasteur, 100 years ago. You can see how these things took ages to develop. We now have vaccines which are apparently pretty safe, though we might want to talk about one or two of those issues because they are quite relevant at the moment, given what's happening in Europe at the moment. But I feel that we should be thinking of with great hope. And this is a message which isn't mine. It's everybody's saying this now. But I think when I first started talking to schools in October about this, I think they were very surprised to hear me saying, you are very lucky to be living now.
Okay, so one of your many titles is Professor of Science and Society. Is that really a concept that you've always had to sort of break down the barrier between science and society, in the sense of making them one thing rather than
it's an interesting question. It's an interesting question. I gave up medicine 4 years after qualification and directed in the theatre, and everybody thought what the hell was I doing? It seemed completely irrelevant. And actually, of course, I did think about doing it professionally.
Hörst du was?
Okay, can whoever's not muted mute themselves? Thank you.
And I mean, we ended up with what was with a smash hit, getting invited to reproduce the play we'd won a prize in Edinburgh to go elsewhere around the country. And I then sort of stood back and thought, no, I've really got to go back to doing something different, what I'm trying to do. But actually, as it turns out, I think that success at the Edinburgh Festival had a very powerful effect on my career, because it taught me a whole lot of things that I hadn't thought about: how you manage a group of people, how you run the finances when you're very impoverished. In a theatre, you're always impoverished. Of course, the combination of music, of picture, of poetry, of words, and communication, all these sorts of things became important. And I think there's no question that has influenced my writing, but more particularly has influenced my teaching, and also how I look at society. And I think you appreciate this particularly, because I think you as a doctor show exactly the sort of things I would like to try and aspire to, which is essentially being sensitive to individuals. It's very, very easy to be arrogant. You know that very well. I know that very well, and we've seen that, and we've seen it during this pandemic. We see it amongst the politicians. We've seen it occasionally with the scientists, but not so often as usual. But I think there's a time to recognize what it says in Tehillim about us being so fragile and so minuscule in the universe. This is really quite extraordinary. I'm just reminded, because this afternoon, I mean, this seems bizarre, but I was reading Stern's essays, his sermons. Stern wrote a lot of sermons, and he writes a sermon about Yaakov, and he quotes him saying, "Ma'at v'ara'im." He doesn't use the Hebrew; he uses the English. Obviously, I've few and evil. My days have been few and evil. 130 years old, and that's an extraordinary thing to think so negatively, really, at the end of a career which, of course, formed one of the most powerful parts of our civilization.
Yeah. So I mean, one of the things that we've all been doing as individuals is watching statistics and interpreting statistics. And there seems, on the one hand, to be a view that scientists are all-knowing and that scientific fact is fact, and interpretation or political spin is maybe something else, and we should stick to the facts. Yet we know, and this, I'll come on to what you were hinting at earlier, we know that the facts are partly dependent on how the scientist sets up his experiment or his interpretation, and that he selects the most likely facts. And we've had a fight almost between the facts and, let's say, practical applications, rather like a fight between the papers on science, on the patient, and treating a patient with its disease. do you think that has misled us all, or
Well,
been a bad thing or a good thing that we now understand what the problems are?
Well, I think it's a human conception rather than a scientific one, isn't it? Perhaps I've been lucky in that, all those, one writes dozens, well, actually over some 300 publications, I think, but, they're all mostly trivial. Actually, most of them very trivial, and most of them be completely superseded by other people subsequently. But every single one of those publications represents a failure because, of course, in order for an experiment to work, you have to learn to fail and then work out how you worked it out. And of course, some scientists are unlucky enough not to fail with their experiment. And that actually, I think, is a real problem. And sometimes it's very difficult. For example, if you're modeling a pandemic, it's very, very difficult to work out how you're going to fail, because, of course, you're being asked actually to succeed and to make predictions. And we all know that scientists can't make predictions any better than anybody else. And I think it's very interesting. If you look at what happened, for example, in September last year, you can see very clearly that there's no question the scientists were very clear. Certainly the Imperial College mathematicians were quite clear that really we needed to shut down. But the politicians didn't accept that. And I think that, it's a question of how other people interpret the science in spite of it. And of course, politicians have a number of different, they can't just look at the scientific fact. They've got to look at what are the normative values of the society, what the economy is doing, and a whole range of things like this. So it's very difficult. I think we're lucky in Britain because, I've been sitting, of course, on the Science and Technology Select Committee, and it's not the first time I've sat on it. I've been sitting on it really since, intermittently since 1999, I think, 98. And what you see, of course, is that again and again we report things to government, but they don't necessarily accept them, including predictions about pandemics. And years later, of course, some of those predictions come true.
But some don't as well.
And some don't. And some don't.
So one of the, as you know, you brought it up, so I'll follow on that for the moment, with the AstraZeneca, let's just stick to AstraZeneca for the minute, where there has been a view that it's substandard. Over the whole time, really, there's been suspicious of it for whatever reason. And this has come to a head recently in Europe. And I think one of the things about pandemics is that they expose the fault lines in society and the societies they hit, whether it's America or us or Europe. America, you see the tensions between the states and the federal. In Europe, between the nation state and the individual states. And here, for me at least, the NHS has stood up to on the whole, stood up to its task very well and has been a brilliant example for the world. Here we have a tension between perceptions of a vaccine, what it's done and not done, and an example of where a politician, particularly in France, has said something that has affected confidence in the vaccine in the world. And I don't know, as an interpreter, whether you have access to more facts than me, as you're on the select committee, so we're judging it without it, and B, what is correct. I have an opinion, but is that the right way to approach it? How do you feel from your perspective this story has played out?
I don't know.
To it?
I mean, of course, obviously, we have access directly to Chris Whittier and so on, and Patrick Vallance and all the rest of them, and other people who are expert. But it's interesting because I've been thinking about this very hard this weekend, actually over Shabbat. And, one thing that does disturb me a bit is that back in the year 2000, I wrote about a young man called Jesse Gelsinger who died. It's in another book called Superhuman. He died when they were trying to use genetic modification to cure him of a disease, the ornithine carbamylase deficiency, which is a dietary disease. You remember it affects your ability to metabolize protein, and therefore you have to limit the diet. He was very well, providing his diet was limited. Anyhow, experimentally in the University of Pennsylvania, they tried to modify the gene. They tried to use one of the first genetic modifications at that time. And it's something that's always interested me because I've done some genetic modification in my subsequently myself. And they used an adenovirus as a viral vector. And it turned out very bad. I mean, he got a shocking reaction to the viral vector and he died. And it was an adenovirus. Now, the interesting thing, of course, is the AstraZeneca is actually also a viral vector vaccine, and it uses adenovirus. Now, this may be completely coincidence. I just don't know. I haven't had a chance to talk to any of the experts yet. But it does seem to me that we have to be very aware that all these vaccines, every single one of them, including the Pfizer vaccine, and particularly the ones which, of course, which involve RNA, which is what we've been having, they're highly experimental. But we're doing the right thing. We're taking them. On the other hand, as I'm sure you would agree, millions of people have been vaccinated with the AstraZeneca vaccine, and in Europe there have been some 30 cases of blood coagulation. But it was blood coagulation which, of course, killed Jesse Gelsinger, which is very odd. I mean, on the other hand, of course, it's very difficult because, as you know very well, this COVID-19 actually affects the vasculature very, very much so, destroys the lining of vessels and causes coagulation. So it's possible that this side effect is not a side effect at all. They were already infected, and therefore they were particularly vulnerable. So I think, I can't answer your question, but it's an important question. And I think what we're doing is right, is to say all these vaccines have a question mark over them. It's not just the AstraZeneca, because of course some of them might be much more long-term. And therefore we're right to do what we think is appropriate. And I think at the moment we are undoubtedly saving lives. I mean, that's the probability. And that's why I think one has a great deal of concern about Boris Johnson's action in September and October, when actually undoubtedly lives were lost because, in fact, we didn't actually take quicker action.
Understood. So I think I had AstraZeneca. I don't want you to get away with saying all your papers were trivial, by the way.
But they were.
You may say so. I couldn't possibly. But I actually think you're part of one of the major miracles of medical progress. So I refuse to accept that nonetheless, despite 2 attempts at dissimulation. Okay, so here we are. We're sitting here. I'm going to move it on a bit from science. You picked up art, and and as we're trying to talk about the good things coming out, do you think that the fact that apart from many aspects, I'll put it this way, is there any good aspect going to come out of us for the arts? The fact we're more of a community, perhaps, the fact that the arts are getting in my living room from New York regularly?
David, of course, as we all know, the effect on the arts, particularly music, classical music particularly, and to some extent theatre, and to some extent the other performing arts, has been absolutely diabolical. It's been they never earn a lot of money. I mean, musicians who work at the festival hall, get about £100 for a gig, and that includes the rehearsal. I mean, it's really quite shocking how poorly top orchestras are paid. So, I mean, that is stunning. But on the other hand, I do think, don't you, that now when we walk outside on Hampstead Heath or wherever we go, or even past gardens in Hampstead Garden suburb, we wonder at things that we didn't really notice before. And I think that's certainly true when we go back to looking at things in galleries. And I think when we start looking at music and doing all the things that art offers, we will see a reflection of our lives in a different kind of way. And I think unquestionably, some of the art that's being produced now, and some of it is obviously being published, looks extraordinarily interesting stuff. And I think art is really about life, and it's about valuing life. And so I think that's part of what we will be doing. And for me personally, because of music is my biggest passion. I mean, as you know, I've been involved with the Royal College of Music for a long time. For me, music is the closest relationship, the expression of human emotion. And I think that's an extraordinary release which we will come back to. Goodness knows how we need to value that stuff in the future.
And have your students been studying or able to?
Well, the RCM's been, well, they study, but the trouble is they can't play together. You can't use Zoom. You can't really do multiple instruments over Zoom because, of course, it's very difficult to tune an instrument on this medium. Certainly, stringed instruments really sound really terrible. And if you're teaching, of course, it becomes more problematic. So it's very, very limited. And I mean, the Royal College of Music has done some remarkable things. Of course, during the last 3 years, we've been rebuilding the inside of it. It's a Victorian building, but we've raised money to really change it massively. So it's going to look great when it's going to have its final opening, which was supposed to be this year, be next year. But ultimately, I think the students will benefit. But it's been difficult being a student. I suppose one slight advantage is that most musicians don't study just for 3 years at the Royal College. They do a 4-year course, and then they do a higher degree as well. So quite a lot of them do 8 years at the college. So they're very much embedded in the system. And of course, during that time, certainly the older students will be out earning some money doing gigs in different, often at a very, very high level. But I mean, I think musicians have been very, very badly hit because they earn so little and because they've not been supported by the Chancellor.
Yeah, I mean, something like Simon Rattle taking up his bag and going off wherever he's going because there's not another concert hall in London seems a bit against what's going on everywhere else in the country, where we are, for better or worse, almost, we can discuss it if you want, a war footing type.
I don't want to talk Simon Rattle down. He's unquestionably a great conductor, but he's a man of very strong opinions, and I don't really understand his particular ambition. Yes, of course, it would be nice for London to have an international standard concert hall like Birmingham or Manchester, but we don't. We have the Festival Hall, which was built in 1950, so it's a bit out of date. But we can improve what we've got, and in a sense, I don't think his plan when he came here was anything other than rather grandiose, actually. And it would actually have been very, very difficult because the sort of money he would need for that concert hall would have really, in fact, taken it all away from the arts. It would have been a massive collapse of what we need to do to support people who are going to actually perform. And the performance is always going to be more important at that level than actually the place where you perform.
Indeed. And nearly all the people that perform arts or work in the theatre are relatively poor, underpaid, etc. And do you think that broadening that to everyone, do you think one of the aspects of the pandemic, it seems to be this, has enhanced social inequalities despite a sort of common feeling of fighting against the enemy?
But I think it's made people much more aware of them, hasn't it? Because we've seen very clearly that the poorer communities are always harder hit. And that's been true historically, going right back to the plague of Justinian, going back to the bubonic plague in 1347, going back to the plague of London in 1665, going back to the plagues in 1850. These plagues, it was invariably the poor people who were worse off and who died in their hundreds of thousands or millions. And of course, the rich people were always complaining about the economy. It's very interesting in 1665, when you look at the accounts of 1665, what you see is that all the poor people are, in the East End by the docks, where of course the pandemic was coming from. And the poor people will leave, the rich people, including the royalty, left London. They went to Oxford. It was, in fact, local government which saved the day, actually, in London. And everybody said, well, the poor and the rich said, well, now the economy is destroyed. But within a year, Christopher Wren had rebuilt London extraordinarily. That's why I'm not convinced that our economy is necessarily nearly as badly damaged as people. I think the rebound is another good aspect of the pandemic. I think we'll start to see how we can recover very much more rapidly than we expected.
Yeah, I mean, part of agreed, and the nice positive as we're moving. We want people to ask questions, by the way, so fire them in if you have any.
Maybe I should stop talking.
Well, I'll ask you one more. One of the things really is the fact that, as we've mentioned a few times, that it's being treated as a war, and you've hinted at this, that these times of adversity, wars have been a stimulus to scientific development, whether it's a Cold War or the Second World War, and many times. So do you think this particular, you've mentioned, we believe, well, although I think the vaccine was there poised, there's been much of positive invention come out of this. And what do you think the main ones are? Maybe we'll end the discussion then, and then people can either fire in their questions or put their hands up.
I think you've come to an absolutely fundamental question. And I think it's a really important one. You're quite right, of course, I'm sure you're right, that war stimulates the best science, but also it also stimulates destruction as well. But the thing that we really will have to do now, what we actually have to understand is that this is a global problem, and the only way it can be solved is by global measures. That includes collaboration and cooperation. That's why what is happening in Europe at the moment is really disgraceful, because actually it goes quite against what should be happening and what needs to happen with countries, for example, in Africa, Asia, and so on. We need to be collaborating. And the interesting thing is that until recently, all we've been talking about is climate change. But I've always felt that actually a pandemic was much more serious immediately because it was more likely to be more immediate. And of course, both those problems can't be solved by one country just decarbonizing their environment. It's got to be done by persuading other people to decarbonize as well as you are. And I think that means that one of the great messages has to be collaboration. And I think that's what brings humans forward. And actually, on the whole, human society has consistently improved with collaboration.
Okay. Great, thank you. So we've been collaborating in doing this. Now I'm going to sort of open it out for anyone that has any questions. You can either, I'll put you on gallery or mine, put your hand up in the conventional way, either electronically or however, or just send a question in. Edward, do you want to? Edward Black asks, is one of the most positive developments an enormous amount of international scientific cooperation?
Yes, I think it is. I think it is, Edward. I think there's a lot of evidence to show that's true. And although, of course, all of us tend to publish in journals which are read internationally. In fact, if you're publishing anything worthwhile, it's got to be a journal which has got a fairly wide circulation. And of course, the internet has helped that. So information is exchanged much more widely. In my own research at the moment, I'm collaborating with one group in Singapore, and I'm collaborating with people elsewhere in Ireland, and possibly in Israel, but that's a question at the moment. And I think that collaboration is very, very important. The problem, I think, is that before we were able to meet face to face, and now we can't. But the work I'm doing at the moment actually is really, I think, potentially quite exciting, and it will be much better if we share it. The problem I've got is that we've just, in fact, patented one part of, or we've just applied for a patent for one part of the work I'm doing. So the question is, how do you manage to collaborate whilst you actually have a vested interest in what is potentially a financial advantage? This patent, in my mind, is not, in fact, to make money, although it possibly could do. It is much more to make the treatment that I'd like to see cheaper and more available. Because if you patent something, you also have control how it's used.
It seems to me that a lot of the work that's being done both for COVID treatment and in terms of vaccine development, huge amounts of cross-border, almost instantaneous cooperation was absolutely crucial to the development work.
I think that's right, Edward. I think the one issue that's been a problem, I think, has been the use of drugs which actually treat people more effectively. Of course, some of them like the steroid drugs, obviously they work very well, and some of the off-formula drugs. But one example is a small company in Britain called Synergen, who are making an antiviral spray which you could inhale. So it would actually, which has got interferon beta, which is one of the things which interferes with the replication of the virus. And the problem with that is that they can't get funding. So obviously they're grabbing the possibility of getting funding from the United States, and we'll lose that. So there is a real issue here that really, if this is a drug that works, it should be widely available and not at a vast profit. And of course, that has been the case, to be fair, with the vaccines. I mean, the vaccines, were not certainly made in a hurry because of profitability. They're made because actually there was a human need. But I think there is this difficulty, this tension about pharmaceutical companies, which of course cost a huge amount of money to make a single drug. You have to, on average, screen perhaps 1,000 compounds. And after 15 years, you have one compound which you have tested and you might be able to take to market. On an average, you're starting at about $1 billion per drug to develop it. It's a lot of money. So one can't feel too hard on the pharmaceutical companies. It's a very, very difficult business. And most of those drugs don't work for long because the patent runs out too. So it's not an easy, it's a very complex environment, I think.
Right. David Lederman, then Joan, and then Mira, I can see your hand there. David asks, should we have shut our borders completely 1 year ago? Would we be in a different situation now?
Yes, we would have been. In fact, in Parliament, I've been for a long time suggesting we should shut borders. But of course, the problem is the economic difficulty and the difficulty of importing stuff, which we need because we can't produce our own essential requirements in Britain, has made that really unfeasible. And I think that's still a problem. But you're right. And I think even now, I think our controls at airports and ports of entry are far too lax. And there's lots of evidence for that. And I think what Israel did was probably much more sensible. And I think we should have probably copied that, but we didn't. And of course, that of course encourages variant viruses, mutations to get in our population, which has happened at least 5 or 6 times.
Okay, trying to keep it positive, but Joan Lipkin-Edwards asks, are we really ahead of Europe? Are they going to go up and us down and us forever? Or she hasn't said this, but I guess the question is, will the vaccine stop that?
As you know, the one area where we are really ahead of the world, and I mean, I hate the notion that Boris Johnson keeps on banging on about a scientific superpower, which is nonsense, given that he's cutting the budget for science all the time. It's done very stealthily, but for example, we're losing money at the moment on the research councils. I think one thing where we've done really well is sequencing the virus. We have been ahead of the world, so we are sequencing the virus at a faster rate and more effectively and more accurately than anybody else. So actually we are mapping the various mutations and we're predicting the mutations. That gives us a head start in making new vaccines or modifying the vaccines we've got already. And so certainly with the messenger RNA vaccines, we'll be able to modify those probably without changing the basic manufacture. That will be a great advantage. I don't know about, because there are different ways of making vaccines. You can kill a virus and give that, you can attenuate it, actually make it less lethal. But I think with the sort of modern vaccinology that's going on now with the messenger RNA particularly, I think the opportunity for modifying is important. And therefore having the sequence of the replicating machinery, the DNA and the RNA is really quite helpful. And we've done that brilliantly. I mean, better than the States. Though they, of course, have all the machines. They built the machines, but we've been using them more effectively.
Okay, Joan, thumbs up if you're happy. If not, unmute and say something.
It's not quite what I was getting at. Europe looks as though it's really down and they're not doing very well and we're doing brilliantly, aren't we clever? Is it going to change? Is it going to suddenly be that Europe's doing wonderfully and we're not
I think
again.
it's a great question, Joan. I think the problem really is, that it's very, very dangerous, I think, to compare different countries because each population is different, the environment is different. I mean, we think we're very close to France, but actually, when you look at rural France, we're very, very different from France in all sorts of ways, communication, for example. And I think, it's like Israel that was able to, Israel, obviously, as we know, was able to, because to vaccinate a lot of people, and obvious reasons. If you've got an army, which is absolutely essential, that you have all sorts of mechanisms by you can do that. And I think. In many ways, we didn't do as well as we should have done. I mean, the NHS, which we're so proud of, the NHS was brought under huge threat because, in fact, of course, leaving aside the fact it was overwhelmed almost, it was very poorly provided. And we gave, so, we were, our young people doing work and our poorly paid assistant people, cleaning wards and so on, were very, very poorly protected. Now, I don't think we should be too thinking ourselves too clever, because actually I don't think we have been. The government, of course, any government, whether it was a Labour or Conservative or Liberal Democrat government, would make no difference. Any government would try and get the best out of the non-facts. But the truth is, there are lots of areas where we haven't done well. But I don't think that's very different from Italy, which currently, at the moment, people are really dying at a large rate.
Okay, Mara, do you want to unmute yourself?
Yeah.
I just have, thank you.
You're welcome.
So I agree with you, Robert. I agree with most of what you've said. There was also the incidents with the government giving PPE tenders to people who really didn't warrant the tenders. And some people have made big mistakes and others have made a huge amount of money over those. Do you think some money should be paid back to the system from those people? Number one. And number two, I appreciate what you said about Synergen. There were political issues on other companies that had vaccines, including an oral delivery company down south called iOS Pharma that had government money to develop their vaccines, were asked to continue their oral delivery for COVID. And then when they approached them for more money, was told, sorry, we've done enough, you're not into humans yet, you're too far behind. So they had to do a deal with an American group called Immunity Pharma and have done a big deal, and here's our science going abroad again. So
yes. Well, I think it's not the science going abroad, it's the technology going abroad. That's
the technology going
it's very
abroad.
Different. That.
Yes.
I mean, the science actually is not going abroad because I think the science is in an open arena. But I think the technology has always gone abroad, and it's been a consistent problem. If you look at, that's one of the reasons why UKRI was set up, the UK Research and Innovation was set up largely to prevent that happening. But of course, it hasn't changed anything yet. Maybe it will. I doubt if it will, because I think it in fact is underfunded. So your point is well made. And also, of course, the government has got all sorts of wonderful plans, like this latest body called ARIA, which is going to have £800 million just to do blue sky ideas, which are high risk, at a time when actually I think what we need is to actually support the research councils. The EPSRC has been starved of money. When I was on the EPSRC, on the Research Council, we were on flat cash. That was, 12 years ago, and it's remained like that. And now, of course, they're cutting the budget further. And this is one of the most successful research councils in the world. Can only be compared with perhaps German engineering and American, but except in biology, we're still better than they are in terms of impact factor. We have the best impact factor in the world in publications. So I don't know what we do about this, because science is valued in Parliament. Our Parliament is unique. It's got more scientific committees. It's got two select committees, one in the House of Commons, one in the House of Lords. It's got the Foundation for Science and Technology. It's got the Parliamentary Office of Science and Technology, of which I'm vice chairman. It's got the All-Party Group for Science, which is a formidable group, and it's got several other bodies which are advising on science. But actually, and when parliamentarians from Europe come to Britain, they are absolutely bowled over. They say, why can't we do this? Why can't we have that kind of scientific input? But somehow it doesn't make much difference when it comes to government.
Isn't that terrible? I mean, it's the politics. So what you're saying is the political influence is greater than, dare I say, common sense or knowledge. It's frightening.
Well, I agree. I'm afraid it is. And I've seen that personally. I mean, I was asked to give a seminar on a completely different subject recently to an all-party group in the House of Lords. And when I gave the seminar, not one of my parliamentary colleagues turned up, except only the general members of the public turned up, because they felt, well, you know, we know it all. And actually none of them were scientists and none of them did know anything about it. And that's not untypical. I mean, of course, they're busy, but I think it is a problem. And I think that's one of the reasons why we need to be thinking about connecting science with the humanities much more, so that actually when we educate people, starting at primary school, they have a broader education.
Yeah, but that leads me back to the comment about the PPE tenders that were handed out by the government. And shouldn't those people be asked politely, with maybe some pressure put on them, to please to tax them on their huge amount of money? And instead the press publicizes one particular family, I can't remember their name, who've just bought a £6 million house on the back of their PPE profits.
What, do you think we would get the salary of the people who ran Track and Trace back? I mean,
oh my God, I mean, really.
You know, Track and Trace was a disaster.
Disaster, yeah.
Okay, moving on to the positive, or is it positive?
Well, it's positive because we're all vaccinated and, you know, live on another day, and we're still all in the science world and doing what we're doing, but screaming about it all the same.
Try and keep happy, Mira. Try and keep.
You've muted yourself, David.
Oh, that's good. Probably a sensible thing to do.
The cup's half full. We're still all happy. Yes.
Exactly. Betty, can you hear me?
I can. Yeah. No, I have a question. Considering you said before there was a very high level of scientific international collaboration, which I think is wonderful and admirable. But how do you understand that there is a complete lack of collaboration with regards to handing out and distributing of the vaccines, and there's actually a fight going on worldwide?
Yes, I mean, but you know, I think every country is still at the stage where it's absolutely terrified of what's happening. I mean, Israel has given out very little of its vaccine. It's given out some, but not very much. And, you know, most countries have been in this situation, and many countries are not giving any because, of course, they still haven't got round. What I would hope is that, I mean, a lot of politicians, certainly the Undersecretary for State for Health, has stated very clearly in the House of Lords that he said, we've actually got to really get the majority of our population reasonably protected first. That's our first responsibility, because unless we do that, we can't start handing out. Betty, I think your question is very well put. I think we probably have to look slightly longer game. You know, what I think was very troublesome was over Ebola. You remember, Ebola is a terrible virus. And, you know, for 30 years, it was raging in West Africa in at least 3 or 4 different countries, with people dying, and nobody was cared about it because they were, you know, black Africans. What does it matter? You know, it was that simple. And it was only when people suddenly realized that if you got on an aircraft, you could be in London within about 9 hours carrying the virus, that suddenly we got full of self-protection. Now, of course, there's a vaccine, and the vaccine is, you know, probably reasonably safe. It looks quite a good vaccine, and it's improving. But you know, and I think now we're seeing that we are really collaborating because it's self-interest. And that self-interest is important. We shouldn't underestimate that, and we shouldn't decry it, because, of course, to some extent, humans will bound to be wanting to protect their own community. And I think we can play on that effectively. And international collaboration is always going to be partly self-interest. We don't welcome people crossing the channel in small boats with open arms. We're now thinking of sending them to Isle of Man, aren't we? I mean, the attitude, we remember that as Jews particularly, because of course, we were in that situation, so long ago, when we couldn't actually gain entry to a settled country where we would be physically safe.
All right, Evelyn, can you unmute and ask if it's you or Larry?
I'm afraid it's me.
Oh, never mind.
Yeah. So Robert, a few weeks ago, I was verbally accosted in a kosher store when I asked the gentleman to put his mask on. And he said, there's no such thing as COVID, it's all made up, blah, blah, blah. And as you know, in the States, there have been some serious issues. In fact, people have been killed when asking other people to put on masks because they just don't believe COVID exists. 48% of Trump, people vote for Trump, said they will not take the vaccine. So clearly there's this, there's this disconnect between science and the population, at least in the States and to a certain degree here. And you've lived in the States, so you know the States well. Do you think there's anything that could be done in the long term to correct this?
It's a very good question, and it's one that's cropped up. Hello. So that's feedback. It's one that's cropped up again and again in the House of Lords. It's something we've been trying to work out what we could do, even trying to impose penalties. I mean, your experience is a particularly unpleasant one, and it's one that I've had as well, though not quite so serious, just somebody just ignoring me completely, where it's just that he put his mask on. But of course, other people have been actually accosted physically in this country. On the other hand, what I do know is that this is being monitored very carefully by central government in Westminster, and they have figures. And it turns out actually that the history of denial in Britain is at very low level compared with the United States. So perhaps in that respect, we are a bit further than the Midwest. And I think, I think it's also true, in France, for example, a huge number of people denying the problem that the virus is producing. And as we know, some parts of East Germany are particularly, I say East Germany, the eastern side of what is now the eastern side of Germany, are also full of non-denial. I think it's a natural response, unfortunately. And education takes time. And we're talking about people who are, on the whole, not prepared to want to listen to proper information because they don't trust information. And I think, I could go on wittering on about this, and I don't want to bore people, but, I don't think our use of social media is terribly helpful, because it doesn't produce an argument. It simply produces a protest. So we don't actually listen to rational debate about things anymore. And we have to start doing that. One of the greatest ways we could improve our society is by really changing primary school education. And I've been we're talking about the positive side of COVID. I've been talking to groups of 1,000 primary school children at a time on Zoom. I just did one this week on Wednesday. I did about 500 kids I spoke to, and I've done up to thousands about my matchman in this country. And there's a sudden appetite for listening to scientists, because they recognize that there is something like a social responsibility, and we can be part of that. I don't know what we do about deniers. They're always going to be there. They've always been there. They were there in 1665. There are stories Daniel Defoe writes about of young people in a pub saying, there were 5 of them sitting in a pub saying, look at those people in the street there. Aren't they foolish? They're all going to die. And of course, they were just carrying on drinking. And in fact, all 5 of those young men died. They were buried within a week.
Okay, I got you, Margaret. I can see you there. Do you think by calling them anti-vaxxers or, for example, or whatever, deniers or delayers or whatever they're called, we actually legitimize their protest? So we've almost given them a title that they can march in favor of.
It's an interesting question. And some of them probably feel quite proud about being anti-vaxxers. But, you know, certainly that happened with climate change denial, didn't it? That even parliamentarians who are denying climate change. But, you know, over time, that attitude has changed in Parliament. Now we're going to see, you know, there's some of those very firmly Tory, usually Tory, right-wing conservatives denying what was plainly obvious has changed. Where in fact, of course, the effect of climate change has been much less physically compared with COVID so far. I mean, obviously that may change. The two will go together because, of course, they are, you know, climate change will actually affect all infections.
Thank you. Margaret, your hand went up and then vanished, so I didn't know. Have you got a question?
Good evening, Robert. Am I muted? No.
Oh, no, we
Robert.
can hear you, Margaret. We
I can hear you.
I'm fascinated to know that you spoke to schoolloads of children. Did you show them your wonderful water experiment that I saw you do once on television? Was it C2O or something amazing? Anyhow, lucky children. My question to you is that I was in a Jewish supermarket the other day and I asked a man to put on his mask and he became very verbally abusive. Obviously, he was very religious and he told me that it is against the law for me to ask him to put on a mask. Is this in fact true?
Well, I can't think what law he would be referring to.
Did you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you perfectly well. I'm not muted, am I? I mean, he was. I mean, he's talking complete nonsense.
Okay, thank you.
Margaret, you can tell him when you see him.
Well, it's against the Jewish law for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, in fact, you know, I have to say,
really hope I never.
There's one kosher bakery where I went into, one that we've all used, by the way, where there was a woman there handing out bread without a mask on, and I mean, it's a bit unsettling when you see that happening.
Yeah.
Are there any other people that want to ask a question? I've got one. Yes, David Broy-Weil.
Hello, Robert. Thank you for a very interesting talk. I just wondered, the 1918 pandemic, from what I understand, it kind of burnt itself out within 2-3 years.
Yes.
Is COVID very different? Would that happen with COVID anyway, or are we in for the long haul?
No, David, you're absolutely right, and it's a very, very important question to answer. If you look at all the, you know, if you look at the plague of Justinian, which was in 541, that had burnt out by 549.
Right.
And it didn't really. It did return in pockets around the Roman Empire, but by that time it was pretty. It was pretty muted. If you take the Black Death, that lasted for several years. 1347 was really the beginning of the high spot, but actually it started to burn out in different areas, and then it moved on. And so it arrived in Britain or in England about a year later with shipping. And I think it's really very interesting because, of course, during my experimental life as a scientist, I've used a lot of rabbits. I mean, I'm very fond of rabbits as animals, and I like them as experimental animals because they're lovely to handle, and they're great for reproduction because they have a short pregnancy and you can actually get a result for your experiment pretty quickly. And they carry Pastorella. They carry that Pastorella pestis, that particular bacterium. And they often were snuffly, and occasionally, you know, one might wonder whether one was going to get, you know, some form of plague from them. But of course, the fact is our immune system adapted. And I think this will happen with COVID because it's happened with all these viruses. You know, smallpox, of course, clearly was eradicated largely through vaccination, but it also became much less serious. Right. And I think most infections do because the memory cells do actually work quite well. The so-called T lymphocytes, which are responsible for memory, or some of them are responsible for the memory, they regenerate. And it's more difficult when you're very old, because older people don't have that memory bank of cells. They don't replicate so well. But one of the things we're finding out, which is very, very positive, is that one of the positive things about COVID has been that we're beginning to understand the process of aging much more effectively. And there's some very, very positive aspects to that. I think the possibility of being much healthier as we get older is a real possibility now, because of what we've learned about the immune system and our response to infection generally. And that is really very positive. So, I think your question's a really important one, because history again and again has shown that these terrible pandemics have always burnt out, and this one will as well, I'm sure.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I mean, if I might just add one point, the pandemic of 1918 affected children in huge numbers, and that has been different about this particular one, thank God. I'm going to close then for open discussion, just end with Rafi, I think, because that's how we started these things a few months ago. And Rafi, just to put it, the title was What's Good About COVID? If I could just ask you, before I thank Robert, or I'll thank Robert now and I'll thank him again, from a sort of Jewish religious point of view, has anything good come out of this? I know Alan Fagenbaum asked the impossible question when we're going to be back to normal religiously, but I'm just saying that question has been asked. But can you see anything good having come about this essentially years shut down so far from the religious perspective?
We can learn from every experience, but I'm very much with you about the it was like when they asked Elie Wiesel after the Holocaust, after Shoah, if he felt better about the state of Israel, and he just said it's not enough. And I know it's not an intellectual answer; it's an emotional one. But I think we're still living with both the huge death rate across the world, but also the psychological effect on all of us. And I think it's very smart of you and Robert to highlight positive aspects, and that's very important as well. But I'm so conscious of what we've lost along the way, and memorializing that, remembering that, is also part of our moving forward. So it's kind of weird. I'm very much forward-looking person and the positives, but I think part of that psychologically and for mental consciousness and stability, we need to be aware of what we've lost and what the cost has been, especially on children.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, I'm going to thank Robert again for his brilliant answers and the thinking that he's given us. I'm going to thank Rafi for all his help over the last 6 months. And I'm going to thank Edward, who omitted to thank himself in his, I was going to say eulogy, but I think that's the wrong word, his entry at the beginning, but it's a eulogy for this 6 months of Motzei Shabbat. It's been great seeing everybody. And
David, is it okay if I mention something about some other stuff that's relevant?
Yes, please do.
Sure. No, I just want to mention that that I was asked to record a Shabbat Hagadol drasha, so I will do that, and it'll be an audio. I don't know, 5-10 minutes, but it'll be also some of the halachas you have to keep, because it's unusual this year with Seder coming on Motzei Shabbat, and also I'm going to send out a little booklet that I wrote. It was in the JC last week, but there's a kind of more easy, handleable version recovering about how we can use some of the ideas of Seder night to reflect about the pandemic. And can I quote you from page 384 in the book? Because Robert at the end talked about how he gave a scientist's manifesto, which is really, really good. And the first line, he says, we should try to communicate our work as effectively as possible, because ultimately it is done on behalf of society, and because its adverse consequences may affect members of society in which we all live. And I think Robert and you have communicated very well tonight, and it's so important that we have an understanding of science. So I'm appreciative of both of you as well. Thank you.
Rafi, thank you so much. And thank you so much for what you're doing for the community. You're hugely respected, and it's wonderful to have you here. And we hope we can keep you within as part of our union. It's a great joy. Thank you very much.
Amen. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay.
Great.